Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to impartially unpack a really fascinating and highly critical analysis of recent U.S. foreign policy moves in the Middle East. If you've been following global news lately, you know things are incredibly complex right now, with shifting alliances and major geopolitical maneuvers happening almost daily. But the source material we're looking at today takes a totally unique angle. It asks us to look right past the standard political narratives and instead follow the money straight down to the foundation of domestic economics.
So the material we're digging into presents a pretty bold hypothesis. It suggests that a massive, struggling domestic investment is secretly the engine driving American geopolitical maneuvers. It's a striking claim, right? The author suggests that to truly understand the United States' current posture in the Middle East, specifically regarding Saudi Arabia and Iran, we shouldn't just be looking at traditional defense strategy. Instead, we really need to look at federal investment portfolios, corporate profitability, and honestly, the lengths an administration might go to prevent a massive financial loss.
All right, here's how the author connects the dots for us. First, we'll look at defense spending and GDP. Second, the Westinghouse investment. Third, the state capitalism argument. Fourth, shifting Saudi nuclear policy. And finally, bypassing congressional oversight.
Let's start with Section 1, defense spending and GDP, or the macro picture.
The author kicks off their argument by looking at the broader U.S. economy. According to the source, increased defense spending is playing an absolutely crucial role in propping up the Q3 and Q4 GDP. Now, on the surface, this might just look like standard economic data, Defense manufacturing creates jobs, it moves capital, and that naturally boosts the gross domestic product. But the author wants us to look closer at exactly where this defense production is going, because the destination of these resources really sets the stage for their entire geopolitical theory. And this is where it gets interesting. The data reveals that the biggest beneficiary of this U.S. defense system production isn't Israel, but Saudi Arabia. The flow of American defense assets is heavily tilted toward the Saudi kingdom. The author uses this data point to suggest that our Middle East policy is fundamentally intertwined with supporting and arming Saudi Arabia, literally placing them at the absolute center of American foreign defense strategy.
Building on that relationship, the source argues that U.S. military postures regarding Iran and Venezuela directly benefit Saudi Arabia. Why? Because Saudi Arabia is actively attempting to backfill China's oil reserve depletion. The narrative here is that as the U.S. exerts pressure on rival oil producers like Iran and Venezuela, it essentially clears the lane for Saudi Arabia to step in and secure massive, super lucrative energy contracts with China. So we're looking at an economic environment where U.S. defense and foreign policy are actively elevating Saudi Arabia's global economic standing.
Moving to Section 2, the Westinghouse investment and the federal catalyst.
So if the U.S. is going out of its way to elevate Saudi Arabia, you've got to ask, why? What does the U.S. government actually get out of this arrangement? Well, to understand the shifting policy, the source points back to the Trump administration, which announced the landmark $80 billion federal investment into a nuclear energy company called Westinghouse to expand infrastructure. This was a massive injection of federal capital, totally meant to stimulate domestic nuclear capabilities and position Westinghouse as a global powerhouse in the energy sector.
But here's the catch. This agreement didn't just provide funding. It actually gave the U.S. government a 20% ownership stake in Westinghouse's profits. The author emphasizes this detail heavily. The federal government wasn't just, offering a grant or a standard subsidy. They became a direct financial partner in a private corporation. This means the U.S. government's own financial success in this venture became directly tethered to Westinghouse's ability to sell its newly expanded nuclear infrastructure.
However, the analysis highlights a massive problem. Based on a recent Washington Post report, there was absolutely no market for this newly expanded nuclear energy. The infrastructure was built, the $80 billion was spent, the government held its 20% stake, but literally nobody was buying. The author argues that this created a massive crisis. The executive branch was now trapped in a terrible investment, left holding the bag on an $80 billion failure with zero return on their 20% profit stake. That brings us to Section 3, the state capitalism argument and entangled interests.
This lack of a market brings us to a highly critical part of the author's narrative about how the government reacted to protect its stake. This is where economics and foreign policy violently collide. The source explicitly characterizes this 20% government stake as an investment rooted in state capitalism.
They compare it to Chinese economic practices, where the government partners in an industry and then essentially forces a market for it. The creator of our source material argues that because the government was financially entangled with Westinghouse, they couldn't just let the company fail. Instead, they had to actively go out and manufacture a market for this nuclear technology, using the heavy hand of American foreign policy to ensure this, quote, shitty investment remained viable.
The creator sharply criticizes the political right here. They claim the GOP is terrified of state capitalism in theory, but completely ignores this $80 billion reality, choosing instead to focus their outrage on 5 subsidized grocery stores in New York City. Now, as an explainer, we aren't here to endorse or validate this political critique, but it's central to understanding the author's frustration. They're pointing out what they perceive as a massive hypocrisy, politicians sounding the alarm over minor domestic subsidies while turning a blind eye to an $80 billion Chinese-style state capitalist venture operating right out in the open.
Let's dive into Section 4, Shifting Saudi Nuclear Policy and Erasing Previous Restrictions.
So how exactly does the government create a market for Westinghouse, according to this analysis? Well, the solution, the source argues, was a brand new nuclear agreement, one that entirely erases the strict restrictions of the 2009 U.S.-UAE agreement, which was crafted by Bush and Obama by explicitly allowing U.S. companies to perform uranium enrichment for Saudi Arabia. Think about it. To create a buyer for Westinghouse's services, the U.S. had to offer a deal sweet enough for Saudi Arabia to accept. And the sweetener, according to the text, was tossing out decades of established nuclear safety protocols. The 2009 UAE agreement strictly forbade this kind of development to prevent arms races, but this new agreement just tears that up.
And here is the absolute kicker. By allowing this enrichment, this agreement places Saudi Arabia 90% closer to having a nuclear warhead capability. Uranium enrichment is not a minor step. It is the vast majority of the work required to build a devastating weapon. The author is deeply alarmed by this, arguing that the U.S. is essentially handing a foreign power the keys to a nuclear arsenal, all under the guise of an energy contract. The strategic risks here are just staggering.
So, looking at this summary, the source outlines a massive shift in global security risks, all allegedly orchestrated just to save a struggling domestic corporate investment. Let's look at the totality of this narrative. We are heavily arming a nation, facilitating their global oil dominance with China, and bringing them dangerously close to nuclear weapon capabilities, simply to force a market for Westinghouse and protect a 20% government profit stake. It's an incredibly bold claim about the hidden economic engines driving global policy.
Which leads us right into Section 5, bypassing congressional oversight and the limits of legislative power.
Now, you might be asking yourself, how does an agreement with such heavy implications just get approved? Surely, handing over nuclear enrichment capabilities requires rigorous democratic checks and balances, right? Well, the text notes that unlike standard treaties, Congress actually doesn't have to approve this new Saudi agreement. They can only try to block it, and the president holds the power to simply veto that block. The executive branch has essentially found a way to bypass the legislative branch on this issue. Because of the way these specific nuclear agreements are structured, the burden isn't on the president to get a yes from Congress. The burden is entirely on Congress to muster enough votes to forcefully stop it, and then somehow overcome a presidential veto.
The author reminds us that lawmakers have actually tried to prevent this before. They specifically note the failed 2018 legislation introduced by Representative Brad Sherman and co-sponsored by Khanna, the No Nuclear Weapons for Saudi Arabia Act. But it failed to pass, and the executive branch retains its broad authority. Even when members of Congress saw the writing on the wall and tried to pass proactive legislation to stop the president from unilaterally sharing nuclear capabilities with Saudi Arabia, the bill died. The framework remains heavily tilted in favor of executive action, allowing these massive state capitalist ventures to proceed with virtually no legislative friction.
Ultimately, this explainer leaves us grappling with a really provocative assertion from the source. Is global security genuinely being compromised just to bail out an $80 billion instance of American state capitalism? The author has laid out a compelling, step-by-step argument connecting domestic GDP, federal investments, and the sudden relaxation of international nuclear guardrails. Whether you fully accept this hypothesis or not, it fundamentally challenges us to look beyond the political rhetoric and ask, when world-altering foreign policy decisions are made, whose financial ledger is really balancing the books?